57. Then Abimelech went to Thebez and encamped against Thebez and captured it. But there was a strong tower within the city, and all the men and the women and all the leaders of the city fled to it and shut themselves in. And they went up to the roof of the tower, and Abimelech came to the tower and fought against it and drew near to the door of the tower to burn it with fire. And a certain woman threw an upper millstone on Abimelech's head and crushed his skull. Then he called quickly to a young man, his armor-bearer, and said to him, "Draw your sword and kill me, lest they say of me, 'A woman killed him.'" And his young man thrust him through, and he died. And when the men of Israel saw that Abimelech was dead, everyone departed to his home. Thus God returned the evil of Abimelech, which he committed against his father in killing his 70 brothers. And God also made all the evil of the men of Shechem return upon their heads, and upon them came the curse of Jotham, the son of Jerubbaal. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. You may be seated. Our kids can be dismissed. There's programming down the hall for them. And what an encouraging scripture to read. Isn't that great? We are halfway through our series and our journey through Judges. And the story so far is this, that there's a sequence of events that continually gets repeated. We have a picture of it every week. We put this up. It's the cycle of sin, oppression, crying out, God's people crying out to him, God raising up a judge, and then who brings victory, and then there's peace in the land, and then the circle will start all over again. But when we get to chapter 9, the story of Abimelech is a departure from the sequence. It's right in the middle of the book, and we're just going to abandon this cycle just for this chapter. It's a horrendous episode in Israel's history, and it serves as an epilogue to the story of Gideon because it is about Gideon's son named Abimelech. Now, there are lots of moving parts to this story, but we can easily divide the chapter into about 4 scenes. So let's tackle it that way today. Let me give you each scene. Scene 1, title would be this: 70 sons on one stone. 70 sons on one stone. Abimelech is Gideon's son by his concubine, who lives in the city of Shechem. And because he is a son of a concubine, it means that from his birth, he has been considered an outsider even in his own family. Gideon has 70 other sons, and they are all by legitimate wives. Now, we could rightly spend some time questioning the legitimacy of having multiple wives, right? But that aside, okay, Abimelech is illegitimate. And that's important because it means that he would not have been on the list to inherit anything of his father's. And if he somehow could have managed to get on the list, there are 70 other sons, right, in front of him who are able to claim a legitimate inheritance. And so Abimelech knows that whatever he gets out of life, he will have to get for himself. And the story is going to show us that he is 100% determined to get whatever he can for himself. And so to begin his master plan towards fame and riches, Abimelech goes to his mother's hometown of Shechem. He goes to his family. Now, this place is important to Jewish people, just like Gettysburg holds a significant place in history for us. Shechem is massively significant to Israel. It's the place where God appeared to Abram and promised to Abram that this land would be what he would give Abram and all of his descendants. Abraham then, once God promises that, right on the spot, he builds an altar to God and worships him there. And so it was the first place in the promised land where there was an altar to God for worship. And because of this, it's also the first place that Abraham's descendants gather and worship God centuries later when they finally cross into the land under the leadership of Joshua. And so Shechem is this spiritual center, heart of Israel. We could say it that it's a barometer of the spiritual health of Israel. And Abimelech rolls into Shechem with only selfish ambition. He gets his family together, his kin, and says, I'm the son of my king-like father Gideon, and on top of that, you and I are family, right? My mother is from here, and so you're all kinsmen of mine. And he lays out a case to them that the 70 other sons of Gideon are all going to want to rule at the same time. And he says this, wouldn't it be better if there was just one ruler? And wouldn't it be best if that one ruler was like one of us, like say me? Like, wouldn't it be best if I were king? And then he did a little song and dance. I just can't wait to be king. You know, that's how that went. And Abimelech must have been a super charismatic dude because the men of Shechem end up agreeing with him. Yeah, you probably should be king. And they begin to follow him. And not only that, but they fund his takeover quest. They give him money from the treasury, from the local temple of Baal that they all worship at, and Abimelech goes and hires what the text says is worthless and reckless fellows to help him. And so Abimelech is now backed by money, and he also has mercenaries. And so he goes out with his gang of hired killers, and they grab all 70 of his half-brothers, and they put them to death on one stone. What does that mean? I'm not sure. Maybe they were all beheaded. Maybe this is like a throw-off-the-cliff situation, something like that. Whatever it was, all of the contenders for the inheritance are now out of the way, and the men of Shechem make Abimelech king. Now, note that this power that Abimelech has suddenly come into was not given to him by God. Abimelech and his rise was not because any obedience that he had to God, but it came by way of the treasury of a false god and by way of the blood of 70 of his brothers. All kinds of other leaders in the book of Judges, even if they're bad ones, are given a revelation from God to lead. They're tapped on the shoulder by God. They're called to lead and to save the people of Israel, but not Abimelech. Abimelech's power is not about delivering anyone or saving anyone. It's about delivering himself to the most prosperous position that he can. And all the usurping that he does is headquartered in this spiritual center of the land in Shechem. And it makes a mockery of the place. It would be kind of like all of the leaders of the United States gathering together at Gettysburg and voting to reinstitute slavery. That's a perverse reversal of everything that is right about that place, right? And that's what Abimelech is doing in Shechem. Here's scene number 2. It's entitled this, A Story of Sway. Verse 5 tells us that 70 of Abimelech's brothers were killed, but it's really 69 because one of the brothers, the very youngest of the brothers, manages to escape. He hides in some way, and his name is Jotham. Now, I want you to remember from last week that we talked about Abimelech's name means my father is king. Jotham's name is entirely the opposite. Jotham means Yahweh is perfect. And so even in the names in the text, we are pointed to the spiritual conflict that is in every one of our hearts. Will I seek the throne for myself, or will I give the throne of my heart to the only one who is perfect enough to sit there? Will I be Abimelech, or will I be Jotham? Jotham is, after he escapes, able to keep low enough profile and avoid capture until the day that Abimelech is actually crowned the king. And during the coronation ceremony, Jotham calls out from the mountain that he is just above where everybody is gathered. And he says this, "Listen to me, you leaders of Shechem, that God may listen to you." And then he tells them a parable. He tells them a story. It goes like this. The trees one day decided among themselves that it was time they had their own king. And so they approached the trees that might be suitable. They went to the olive tree. That's the scripture that's on your screen. They went to the fig tree. They also went to the vine. And all of those trees refused because they had more important functions to perform in this life, like the ones that they were created for. Now, it's important that you know that olive trees and fig trees and vines were very valuable and produced the main crops of the Israelite agricultural economy. And in Jotham's story, all of these important trees say, I've got more important things to do than to hold sway over all of the other trees. And so they all pass on becoming king. But in his story, he says, the thorn bush, the bramble, is interested in the position. Thorn bushes are not at all valuable plants. They were too short, they're too scraggy to provide any kind of shade from the heat. They often catch fire, and when they catch fire, they would then quickly spread and destroy all of the more valuable trees. And so the thorn bush actually kind of points this out when he accepts to become king. He says, if you're serious in making me king, then all of the other trees can come and take refuge in my shade. Now, that's kind of comical because a bramble, a little thorn bush, is, just a foot or two off the ground. But he says, all the other trees can take refuge in my shade. If you want me as king, then enjoy the shade I offer. But if you're just playing with me, look what he says. Then may I catch fire and destroy every tree in the land. Now, the people who are listening down below understand because they work the land. They quickly understood the message of the parable. Thorn bushes were good for burning, not really anything else. They definitely weren't good for shelter. And so Jotham's critique is that the people are doing something as foolish as taking shelter under a thorn bush in making Abimelech their king. Making Abimelech your king is dumb. Not only will he shred you with his thorns, but you're going to get burned too. That's Jotham's point. And then Jotham ends with a challenge. We could call it a curse. He says this to the people: if you've been fair to Gideon's family, me, in making Abimelech your king, if that's what you call fair, and let's face it, it's not, but let's say it is, if that's fair, then may you find great blessing in the rule of King Abimelech. But if you haven't been fair with Gideon's family, and let's face it, you haven't, because they're all gone, I'm the only one left, then I hope you and he get what you all deserve. I hope that you're burned by him and that he's burned by you. Scene 3, Shechem's spirit, shadows, and salt. Eventually, Jotham's prediction of fire breaks out. And Abimelech rules for 3 years when a spirit of conflict comes between him and the people of Shechem. It's as if, surprise, surprise, things don't go the way that they thought they would with Abimelech in power. And so the citizens of Shechem have already proven to be kind of fickle in this area. And so when a guy named Gal moves into Shechem, it says they put their confidence in him. Now, it's probably pronounced Gaal, but I like Gal because it's a guy named Gal, and that's funny. Okay. And there's a ton of irony here that Gal worships at exactly the same temple that the money had come from to fund Abimelech's coup. And also, there's irony here that Gal uses the same charismatic arguments to win the people that Abimelech had used when he was trying to win the people. And Gal ends up winning the hearts of the people of Shechem and puts himself forward as the leader that they've all been waiting for. And they all go along with this. Now, Abimelech has an informant, an officer named Zebul, who informs him about Gal's plans. And he advises Abimelech, he says, take all of your men, go out in the field around the city, and hide at night under the cover of darkness. And Abimelech does this. He and all of his men hide in the shadows of the field at night. And when Gal and his men come out of the city in the morning, Abimelech and all of his men spring out, and Gal is ambushed and crushed by Abimelech's army. But Abimelech doesn't stop there. The next day, even as everyday non-military people leave the city to go out and work in the fields, Abimelech slaughters them too. They're not even fighters. They're not even armed. And then he goes into the city and attacks the city itself as a final insult. He covers the whole land and the city in salt. That was a symbolic declaration that the city is now desolate and would never be fruitful again. And so Shechem, the place where Abraham had worshiped the Lord and where Joshua and all of the people had worshiped the Lord, now ends up barren and desolate because of Abimelech. Here's scene number 4, a shoulder and a split skull. The leadership minority that are left in the city take refuge in the temple of their idol, Baal. And they hole up in the stronghold that was part of Baal's temple in that place. It was probably an underground vault of some kind, and they feel safe there. They think, surely Abimelech will leave us alone in a building that's dedicated to the God that we all worship. But it does not go that way. Abimelech knows where they are, and he goes down and he cuts some brushwood, and he puts it on his shoulder. And he says to his men, I want you to do what I do. Now, if you'll remember from last week, that's a phrase that should ring a bell, right? Because that's the phrase Gideon used with his men. Do what I do. And the Midianites were defeated. But here, when Abimelech says it, it's not going to be to save God's people, it's going to be to kill God's people. And so he and his men take the brushwood that they've cut, and they hoist it on their shoulders, and they put it over the vault where all the people are inside, and they set the wood on fire, and everyone in the vault perishes because the fire was set on top of them. Now, I want you to connect all of that back to Jotham's curse, to his warning to the people. And his curse, you can see, is fulfilled in a remarkably literal way. The fire that destroyed the leaders of Shechem is fed by brushwood that would have surely included thorn bushes, the very label Jotham gave to Abimelech in his story of the trees. And then in verse 48, we also learn that Abimelech puts the wood for the fire on his shoulder. Now, that's a really weird detail to include until you discover that the word Shechem in Hebrew means shoulder. And so the name of the city, Shechem, which means shoulder, becomes a prophetic foreshadowing of its own destruction. Shoulder, the city, will be set on fire with the brambles carried on a shoulder. Or we could say this, a shoulder of thorns will incinerate the city of shoulder. And however you slice it, Jotham's curse comes true. Fire comes out of the bramble, that's Abimelech, and it devours the cedars of Lebanon, that's the people of Shechem. Verse 50 tells us that Abimelech isn't quite done. He then heads to the town of Thebez, where he has people trapped in much the same way. This time, it's a tower that they all run into, and they go up to the roof. And Abimelech has very much the same idea. He's going to fight his way to the tower, and then he's going to put wood around the base and burn everybody out. But we're told that as he gets closer to the door of the tower to burn it, a woman from the rooftop of the tower throws an upper millstone down and hits Abimelech on the head and crushes and splits his skull. An upper millstone was part of the process of milling grain. There was a large, probably 100-pound or so lower stone that the grain would be spread out on. And then the upper stone was this piece that was formed into the shape of a hand. And so it was used to grind the grain against the lower millstone. And so this is a handheld tool that is light enough to carry, but heavy enough to crush a skull from the right height. And the fact that this woman had a millstone in the first place tells us that these people were just grabbing anything they could to defend themselves against Abimelech. And also, what a good shot she is. Like, she had one chance, and she made the most of it. And so down below on the ground, Abimelech is fatally injured but not dead. And in line with his ego and pride, he doesn't want this to be the way his story is written, killed by a woman tossing a stone on my head. And so he calls his armor bearer and he says, kill me so this won't be the story about me. And he does. And guess what story is told of Abimelech? You just heard it, right? He was crushed. His skull was crushed by a girl. Yeah, that's what happens. And it's not a commentary about the girl being less, only that she wasn't a trained soldier. It's a condemnation of the overconfidence of Abimelech, the real soldier. It would be kind of like Taylor Swift getting a bunch of Swifties together and taking on, I don't know, maybe the Chicago Bears. And if she wins, she's not the one we point to, right? She's not the real football player. It's the Bears who get the shame forever because they're the real football players, just not this year. Okay. Let me take a poll at the end of the story because that's the story. Those are the 4 scenes. Let me take a poll real quick. How many of you, raise your hands, how many of you are sad at the end of the story that Abimelech meets his end and gets his skull crushed? Anybody? Other side. How many of you are glad that Abimelech met his end and rooting? Actually, you're rooting for the woman from the top of the tower. How many? Yeah. I think most of us are there. Surely we're glad that evil got what was coming. Why is that? I want you to hold on to that thought just for a second. In Abimelech's story, something is glaringly absent, and maybe you caught it as we were going down through. Maybe you caught it as you've been reading through Judges. I hope you've been doing that. And what is absent from chapter 9 is God himself. God isn't even mentioned once by his personal covenant name, which is Yahweh or Jehovah. And so we have a society and a self-proclaimed ruler in this chapter who have pushed God out of the picture completely. In all of the life of Abimelech, God is unworshipped and he is unconsidered. And here's the question: is God really absent? Because it sure seems like it. I mean, the Shechemites are using idol money to fund a massacre. Abimelech is shedding blood wherever he goes. God doesn't seem to be anywhere. Even Jotham, who comes in and gives this little consequence, he has to escape to Beer, which just means well and could literally have been anywhere because wells are everywhere. And he fled because he was afraid of his brother Abimelech. And you have to wonder if Jotham at times thought, maybe I was wrong. Maybe Abimelech should be king. Maybe I was wrong. Where is God? Justice doesn't seem to be happening here. God seems to be absent. But twice in this chapter, if we look very close, the narrator does give us hope. He gives us a glimpse of what God is doing. I want to point you to verse 23 and 24. It says this: "And God sent an evil spirit between Abimelech and the leaders of Shechem." And then I want to point you to verses 56 and 57. This is after the woman has dropped the millstone on Abimelech's head and he has died. And I find it funny that the minute he died, it says all of the Israelites went home. Like there was nothing, okay, we're done. They just all went home. Verse 56 says, "Thus God returned the evil of Abimelech, which he committed against his father in killing his 70 brothers. And God also made the evil of the men of Shechem return on their heads. And upon them came the curse of Jotham, the son of Jerubbaal," which is Gideon. That's his other name. And God may have been silent, but he was not absent in this chapter. In what seemed like a natural course of events, God was actually acting in judgment. There was no lightning bolt from heaven, but even so, there was justice at the end of the day. Paul puts it this way in Romans 1:18. He says, "The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all of the godlessness and the wickedness of men who suppress the truth by their wickedness." God's judgment is not only reserved for a future day, it is also a present reality. And so here's the takeaway from all of this today. God makes sure that unrepentant people face payday someday for their evil deeds. God makes sure that unrepentant people face payday someday for their evil deeds. All of the Abimelechs of this life, one day, not in our timing, but in God's, one day, will face the eternal consequences of their life. no sin ever goes unpunished. And on one hand, we listen to that and we love that because we're all about justice. We just voted, right? We're all about justice. We rooted against Abimelech. We applaud a God of the universe who holds the murderers and the rapists and the exploiters and the oppressors and the swindlers to account. God's judgment will never be an outdated idea to us because the violence of people in this world is never outdated. And it's the violence of people that we long to see righted. Evildoers must face the consequences of their evil deeds, and we love that there's a God of judgment, because if there's not a God of judgment, there is no hope against such things. There is no hope for this world. But on the other hand, we realize very quickly that having a God who is serious about his judgment against evil also means that we will have some level of judgment levied against us. Oh man, I may not be a murderer, but I've thought it. I may not be a swindler, but I've done my share of cheating. I may not be the world's worst tyrant or oppressor, but I've burned some towers in my life. I've done my share of pushing God out of the picture completely until he is unworshiped and unconsidered. And so as much as I long for a God of judgment because there's no hope for this world otherwise, I also realize that if I have a God of judgment like that, then there's no hope for me. And what's the answer? Once again, I want to point out that Abimelech is not a judge. God never comes and picks him. He never saves anybody but himself. He dies in the end, and through all of his sordid and evil ambitions, even though he's not a judge, he does point us again to the ultimate judge to come, the only judge that can provide a solution for our dilemma. And so the question is, how does God judge the world without judging us? And here's the answer. He judges himself. 2 Corinthians 5:21 puts it this way, that for our sake, he, meaning God, made him, meaning Jesus, to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. We have a judge who has been judged in our place. We have a judge who took all of the sin on himself that warranted judgment against us, and he was judged in our place. And when we accept his work, we stand then uncondemned. We stand not guilty, but we stand pardoned. We stand not sentenced, but free. We stand not in judgment, but we stand in acceptance and in love. And so there are two camps today, if you're listening. The first camp is maybe you're not a follower of Jesus today. Here's what you need to understand from Judges chapter 9. You have evil in your life that is worthy of judgment. You do. And God is holy and righteous, and he will deal with your evil. You owe a debt to God because of your sin. But the invitation of the gospel today is that Jesus has offered to pay that debt for you. And so if you're not a follower of Jesus today, would you deal with your own evil by receiving and accepting the redemption and the reconciliation that God has provided through Jesus Christ? You will not get away with your wrongdoing. Nobody ever does. But Jesus comes and covers it. He has stepped in and faced the consequence of your own sin on your behalf. Jesus has made a way that sin doesn't have to be the last word that is written about your life. And so the invitation is, would you come to Jesus and accept his work on your behalf today? Here's the second camp. Maybe you're listening and you've been following Jesus for a while. Here's the message to you. God's judgment is real. God's judgment is sure. It may seem like God is absent, but he is working always to reverse all of the wrong in this world and make it right. He is working even when you can't see him. And the narrative in Judges 9 assures us that God will bring about justice. Evil people will get their due. And this is a great encouragement for some of the people in the room who have been victims of evil, because that means there's hope. But it's also the reason that we can choose not to seek revenge against those who wrong us. You see, if God is the judge, then that means that you don't have to be. And so the invitation is to take yourself out of that seat. Do not retaliate. Let God deal with the evil of others against you, and He will. Jesus is the judge who was judged, so that all who believe in Him can face the future judgment day with confidence. And on that day, because we are pardoned, He will be able to end evil without ending us. God, we worship Jesus Christ, the judge of all earth, who came the first time not with a sword in His hands, but He came with nails through His hands. And He came not to bring judgment but to bear judgment. He ended violence by absorbing violence on the cross. Thank you for His work that destroys every evil, but somehow in the process does not destroy us, even though we're evil. And so thank you for the judge that was judged for us. And it's in the name of Jesus, the just, who will forever do what is right, that we pray. All the people said, amen. Would you stand? Let's worship together.